Good evening, everyone. Today I have a very special, interesting guest in our studio. His name is Mr. Mark Lee Hunter. He is investigative journalist, and he is founding member of Global Investigative Journalists Network, also author of Story-Based Inquiry. Good evening, sir. So let's start to talk about clear difference between investigator and investigative journalist.
There are many kinds of investigators. By the way, I like talking to them. They're very interesting people.
Investigators,
Yeah, there are police who investigate. There are corporate investigators. There are insurance investigators. Okay. The big difference between them and journalists is that their work is destined to, shall we say, private or government clients. Okay, they are providing information to other actors who will take the decisions and follow the procedures that get the results they're looking for. Okay, for a police investigator, he's giving the information to a prosecutor who will then decide whether or not to bring a case. The journalist is doing this work for the public. I mean, his or her function is to gather complex information, work out the contradictions, find out what really happened, and then tell as many people as possible. They're giving away the story, you know, rather than keeping it for private or governmental gain.
Interest. So,
yes.
Can I say investigative journalists are doing the deed for the public and out of their humanity? Is that it?
I'd like to think that was always the case. It's certainly the case a lot of the time. Okay. Well, it's not always the case, let's be honest. Okay. There are journalists who do the work by ambition. There are, you know, occasionally there are journalists who do it by revenge. In the history of the profession, okay, there was one point where investigative journalists had a very bad name because they were doing it to blackmail people. You know, you would, you would do a portrait of a company and then say, buy advertising in the publication or we'll publish this.
Use it as a weapon.
Yes, absolutely, it can be a weapon. But the contemporary investigative journalists that I know, and you know, I know hundreds if not thousands of these people, are doing it because they want to change the world in a better way. They want the world to be less of a mess. They want it to be less cruel, and they want it to be less unjust. And that's why they're doing the work. They're doing it for social benefit, social value.
In investigative journalism, is there, in modern days, today's world, is there any new trend or new way of writing or the workflow?
In the, you know, 40 years ago, people discovered documents. They discovered that there was this huge amount of public documentation. And then, about 10, 15, 20 years after that, they began to discover that there were large amounts of data. And now that everything is digitized, the amount of data has exploded. So the big issue that journalists are dealing with is, how do we manage that data? How do we use it? How do we extract the meaning? And how do we turn it into stories? On the other hand, there's a developing specialty of people who know how to verify tremendously varied qualities of information, including social media information. Okay, and you know, I could name people like Henk Van Ness or Paul Myers of the BBC. You know, these are people who are absolute magicians in finding the truth behind something that pops across the social media. On another hand, okay, the appearance of social media makes it much easier to find human sources, someone who actually witnessed an event. You know, there was a journalist at The Guardian, you may have heard of this case. A guy was extradited from the UK and he was killed in the plane by the people who were extraditing him. Okay, something went terribly wrong and they, you know, the poor guy got smothered. And this reporter was able to find eyewitnesses to the event, by putting out a call through social media. That was a very significant sign that things had changed, that our ability to get in touch with people through these media had gone up significantly.
So on the other hand, social media has this benefit for investigative
Absolutely.
journalists. Based on what you told, the story you just told, how can a journalist himself protect himself from all these threats?
You mean
psychological threats, or any other threats? How can one be on the path?
Well, in one way, okay, everybody in the world right now is less secure than they used to be. Okay, we know this. Okay, civilians get run down by terrorists. Okay, I mean, and people put frauds out over the internet.
Yes.
So this is a general problem. There are specific problems related to that larger movement that hit journalists in particular. People trying to get into your computer, people trying to get into your databases, people trying to steal your information. And then, of course, sometimes there are physical threats. The physical threats facing war zone reporters now are much greater than those facing investigative journalists because, combatants are now targeting journalists.
Especially targeting journalists.
Yes, they are. It's a big, big issue. And with the exception of certain countries, one could mention Russia or Azerbaijan, physical threats against journalists are more rare. Okay. But, one thing that every investigative journalist has to deal with is the psychological pressure of wondering if they've got the story wrong. If they're going to hurt someone wrongly. Yeah, I mean, you can be afraid about having the story right. You can say to yourself, well, I'm going to be making terrible enemies. But, most of the time, when you work on a big story like that, you also make a lot of friends. There are a lot of people who care about whether or not something is true, and especially if it affects their interests or their lives or their values.
Right.
And these people become your allies. Do
you make more friends there on the way?
Friends, allies, partners, but also people who are just paying attention to you. And I always tell my students, that you mustn't be alone with a big story.
You mustn't be alone.
You mustn't be alone with a big story. The legend of investigative journalists was always that they were lone wolves, out finding the truth.
Yes.
Like Philip Marlowe, who wasn't a journalist but operated alone.
So has it changed? Has it changed the environment of the journalists? Of
course, we all work in organizations now.
Now
we all work in collectives, in organizations, in teams. This is a very, very major change. Probably one of the last great individuals in the field is Andrew Jennings, the guy who broke the scandal about FIFA, the football federation. Andrew worked alone a great deal, but Andrew too had a growing network of allies and friends and supporters, both in organizations and individuals, as he moved through life and toward the end of that magnificent investigation. And his career captures the change. There are others like Andrew, but now we're seeing bigger and bigger journalist organizations, like the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which would have been unthinkable 30 years ago. An organization that's at once a network of hundreds of journalists in different countries and a large central organization that gathers the information, edits the stories, keeps the data. These things were unthinkable when I began.
Right, and it has changed a lot since then.
Oh boy, for the better.
On that, I was going to ask, how can a journalist keep the humanity when he or she is going after a source or information. There are so many people are involved, and how can the journalist keep the ethic or the humanity inside? Try not to hurt the people on the road. Do you know what I mean? So just looking after one direction, okay, I'm going to find this and this. But you also have to care the people coming on the way.
You do, and you know, this is something that we've talked about a lot in our community recently. Deb Nelson, who won, a wonderful woman who won a couple of Pulitzers, you know, has always been carefully thinking about this for years. She influenced my career when I started out. You know, Deb said we shouldn't be ambushing people. We should be staying transparent with them and keeping them aware of what we're finding and giving them a chance to comment as we go. She was one of the first to say that, and that's increasingly becoming standard practice. Okay. A second issue is that in any investigation, the first people who talk to you are the people who got hurt.
Who got hurt?
Yes, and that doesn't mean they're always telling the truth. It doesn't mean they're always good people. But it means that you have to take into account that they've suffered, and that suffering can make them a little crazy. It can make them very sad. You can't fix it. You can tell their story, but you can't fix it.
And fixing is not your job, you're saying?
Well,
I mean, tell the story.
It's your wish, but you can't make any promises. I remember very well at the end of one of my investigations once, I went to see a guy whose career had been shattered because he did the right job. And I said to him, I said, look, I said, I'm going to publish this story. I'm going to prove you were right, but I can't get your life back. And he said, well, and we had a beer together, and then I went home and published the story.
And he said, go with it?
Well, he didn't have that choice. I was going to publish it. Okay, I told him I finished the job.
You were direct, you were honest about it, and you just...
Sure, but the amazing thing was, he got his career back. The story got him his career back.
Oh, that's very nice end then,
story. It was wonderful, but I could not promise that to him. There's another aspect of this as well, which is that you can't do an investigation alone, or in any case, whether or not you're in an organization, if people perceive that you don't care about what happened to them or what could happen afterwards. Okay, people are judging you as you move down the path. It's like a village, okay? You know, when you move to a new village, people are
looking at you, yes.
People are looking at you, and they talk about you in the baker shop, okay? And they say, what's he like, you know, who's he dating, you know, what does he look at out of his window, you know? People are discussing you, and this news travels very fast among the people who know the story. And if they perceive that you're doing the story for the right reasons and you care about doing it well, then they start to come to you and they say, okay, they say, you're the one I've been waiting for. There's a moment like this in the film Erin Brockovich.
Erin Brockovich, yes.
Yeah, which is a wonderful movie where Julia Roberts is sitting in a bar and a guy comes up to her and says, I've been watching you. I know I can tell you everything. And she thinks, oh my God.
I remember the scene, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And it's a very true scene, you know. This happens to most investigators.
And have you had that experience?
Yes, I have.
Oh, very nice.
And then the guy says, I have what you're looking for.
The documents.
Yes. And people do say that to you when they realize that you're trying to do it right.
Trying to do it right way out of your humanity.
Yeah, trying to tell a story that may make the world a little better tomorrow than it is today.
Well, let's talk about Mongolia. You've been here, this is your 4th time, is it?
Yes, it is.
Have you noticed any change, betterment to our Mongolian journalists' attitude or professionalism throughout these years?
There are journalists in this country now who are incredibly skilled who weren't at that level of skill 4 years ago. Okay, I'm thinking of, oh gosh, it's hard for me to pronounce his name, guys like Lagfa at Mongol TV, the guy who worked on the Panama Papers case. I mean, this is, you know, this guy is global level professional. And, you know, these people weren't as evident 4 years ago.
Right.
There's something else that's changed, okay?
Okay.
4 years ago, what journalists in Mongolia said all the time was like, we can't do our job right, okay, because the media are dominated by political or financial interests. You know, there's limits on what we can do. They were very unhappy. And now...
Most of it were complaining.
Sure. Journalists complain everywhere, okay? Journalists love to complain. God knows why, because it's actually a pretty nice job. But they love to complain.
Right.
Well, it's a hard job, okay? I can understand that. It's not easy every day. And when you can't tell the truth, when you're capable of seeing the truth and documenting the truth, and you can't tell it, it becomes a very, very unhappy job.
Very
Okay, so people were very unhappy. And now I see people who are bursting with energy and desire and hope.
If there is anything you would criticize about the journalists in here?
Not all journalists become journalists for the right reasons. Okay?
And what is the reason you're saying?
Well, this is a minority, okay?
Minority, yes.
Yes, I'd say about 20%.
Right.
Okay, based on my experience with my students over the years. But there's a certain number of people who become journalists because they don't really respect themselves, and they see it as a path to speaking to people who are more interesting than they are. The incredible thing about a journalist is that we're the only profession that has the right to pose any question to anyone, anytime.
Well, that's all for today. Thank you for being with us. You're watching Today. We will see you on next Tuesday with more news and updates. Have a good one. Bye-bye.